It started on a rain-curled evening when the city felt like a bowl of softened glass. In the glow of sodium lights, streets looked like ribbons of oil, and the world was quieter in the way things become quiet when people are inside and weather takes the edges off. Marcus drove home after a double shift that had thinned his patience to the size of a coin. Rain slapped the windshield in steady percussion. The wipers made a slow, dependable rhythm that soothed something raw inside him. He liked driving when the radio hummed old songs and the road offered an excuse for solitude. He did not expect an offering. At mile marker 22, just beyond a bend where the highway narrowed and the trees leaned in like listeners, the hazard lights of a car flashed like a small lighthouse. Marcus slowed, eased onto the shoulder, and saw the umbrella standing upright as if someone had stabbed a flag into the wet ground. Beside the umbrella lay a pair of children's shoes, leather, scuffed, the laces undone and ruined by rain. They were arranged with a neatness that hurt, placed side by side like someone had set them down and expected them to be picked up. The shoes themselves were inexplicable until he noticed the faint trail of prints that led away into the trees, small indentations that suggested a child had walked, not run, but then gone on without a mark of hurry. He called dispatch with his voice folded thin, and then 911 because it felt like the only reasonable next line action. The operator's voice over the phone was steady. "Stay with your vehicle. We'll send someone out." He huddled under the faint cover of his hazard lights and watched others drive past as if the umbrella and the shoes were props in a different life. When the officers arrived, they took photographs and bagged the shoes. They shone flashlights into the darkness and followed the faint indentation of a path until the trail was swallowed by hollows and water. The prints ended by a culvert where rainwater roared like a mouth that swallowed sound. The officers peered into that dark throat and reported nothing. They collected evidence with latex gloves and moved with the same careful bureaucracy that makes human calamity legible. In the days that followed, the asphalt of that road became a story, a rumor that unspooled like old twine. A trucker reported a small umbrella another hour down the same stretch a week later. A motorist found a single mitten pinned to a guardrail by a small stone. Marcus could not stop thinking about the shoes like a wedge in his thoughts. At night, his apartment felt like a theater stage missing a person, empty clothing on a chair, a mug still clinging to steam, and the impossible image of a small shuffle of feet moving across his hardwood. He wrapped the shoes and slid them into a box in the back of a closet as if containing them might also contain the meaning. A month later, a local news blurb spoke of a missing child from a neighboring county, last seen near a roadside diner during a thunderstorm. The timing overlapped with the day Marcus had found the shoes, but the details never matched cleanly, names and times bent and slipped like fish. The investigators cross-checked phone records and witness timelines and compared lists until patterns blurred. Marcus answered questions about his route and the precise place where he had stopped. The officers were gentle in their tone, the kind of politeness people deploy when they must move through other people's grief. They suggested he might have seen a runaway, a prank, a misdirection. They left him with a card and a promise that sometimes, little things returned to say themselves. Marcus found that rain had changed the grammar of his nights. The sound of it on tin and glass carried an ability to admit images, small boots scuffing across floors, a breath pressed to the lip of a window. He began to note the weather on a small calendar and to avoid that stretch of road on nights forecast for heavy downpour. He stopped eating at late-night diners alone, and he answered the door only with the chain latched until he recognized the voice on the other side. He told his close friends the story in fragments, each telling a slightly different hue. Some laughed nervously and offered rational explanations, others sat with him in silence, understanding the reason for his new, careful habits. The second night story is not about an offering placed on a road but about a house that learned to hum. People speak of old houses like they speak of relatives, funny quirks, ghosts in the way floorboards complain, but the Victorian on Maple Street had a different appetite. It sat under a tangle of maples and had architectural folds that kept secrets, narrow staircases, attics like folded sleeves, windows with glass that slightly bent the world. Aaron bought the place because it was cheap and because he liked projects. He took joy in sanding banisters and searching basements for original hardware. After a while, the joy became brittle. On the first storm after he moved in, he heard it. A lullaby hummed low beneath the floorboards. It was not the wind and not the pipes. It had a timbre that suggested lungs learning how to fill and empty in a rhythm like a child's slow breathing. At first Aaron convinced himself it was a neighbor's radio, a television pitched low, a trick of memory. But the lullaby moved within the house, as if it understood the rooms. It threaded itself along the baseboards, pooled in corners, and echoed softly under floor joists. He found a shallow nesting space carved in the attic beams, a matted blanket with the smell of long damp wool and a tin whistle dulled by rust. Each discovery felt like a private accusation. Small tokens began to appear. A tiny sock tucked under stair treads. A string of beads hung on a banister. Wet prints traced small hands along glass. Aaron installed cameras in corners with a flush of embarrassed pragmatism. The cameras often showed nothing, only the hum of night, a truck passing, the steady drip of rain, but intermittently they captured the suggestion of movement, a shadow blurred near a window, a darker smear that the algorithm could not quite parse. He invited a friend to stay overnight out of a need to prove he wasn't fabricating fear. They joked until 3 in the morning. The lullaby rose again, and this time the friend heard it too. They checked the attic. The blanket's dampness suggested recent use. The friend left the house at dawn with the practiced stride of someone who had decided to be practical about the impossible. Neighbors offered stories like quilt patches. Old Mrs. Waller kept a boy for a while in the 60s, one said, as if naming a rumor would stitch it to a narrative. A local historian told Aaron about a missing nanny and a rumor of a child who slipped from a window and was never found. These stories nested comfortably in conversation and gave the house a human shape, a history to be held. But the lullaby refused tidy closure. It would change lines, sometimes borrowing a phrase Aaron's grandmother had whistled, or including his own name in a cadence that sounded like memory that had misremembered him. The change made him feel watched in the strangest possible intimacy, not a violent stare, but the careful, rehearsed attention of someone counting rooms. The third tale unfolded on a city bus where strangers ride like punctuation marks along the paragraphs of a long city night. Olivia worked late shifts and often took the last route home, the bus a narrow capsule of fluorescent light and sullen faces. Rain turned the window into streaks of color, neon signage smeared into a palette that made faces look lacquered and soft. One night the bus stalled beneath an overpass. The lights flicked and the hum of electricity thinned. In that lull Olivia felt something close, a pressure like breath against the back of a neck. She turned and saw a man in a wet blue coat who had not been there before, water beading at his cuffs, hair plastered to his temple, his smile a seam that extended in a way that did not fit human comfort. He sat for a few stops and then shifted closer in a way that made the hair on her arms lift. He offered no words. When the bus lurched back into motion he blinked and was not there. Only a puddle of water remained on the vinyl where he had sat, as if someone had been present but had left only a memory of dampness. Others rode that bus over following nights and described similar sensations, a cold press at the nape of the neck, the sense of someone rearranging a blanket on a sleeping passenger, wet footprints on the aisle that tracked and then evaporated. The transit authority checked cameras and sometimes found chunks of footage corrupted by static. One expert said tape placed in high humidity conditions will glitch, and another driver said he had seen a figure lean over a sleeping woman only to disappear the moment he turned. The idea of a passenger who rode only in storms began to circulate like a complicit rumor. Commuters started changing their habits. They coordinated rides from friends, rode earlier buses even when less convenient, and texted each other about sightings like weather alerts. An informal network developed that mapped rides and times where wet anomalies seemed more frequent. Video analysis produced frames where the aisle glitched for precisely the minutes the bus stalled and then rewound into continuity. Specialists called that a data artifact, but the people who had felt that presence did not need footage for proof. They remembered what it felt like to be looked at by something that arrived in weather. The fourth story grips the inward spaces of a boarding house where walls might keep breath as a secret. Maya, a student who needed cheap rent, took a narrow room with a balcony that would be perfect for a plant. The landlord was an odd man with apron strings of stories. He smiled behind his hand when she asked about the place's history. The pipes complained and the floor hummed like a continent. On her third night, with rain glassing the windows, she noticed the closet door ajar, although she had closed it. Inside the gap a faint movement heaved like breath. She pushed the door and found nothing at first, only a chair and some old coats. But then her eye caught a hairline seam in the wooden paneling, an old cutout, and a place someone might have used to watch. She became obsessed with the seams. She pried open a baseboard and found discarded wrappers beneath the floor, and a small, rusted transistor radio that sometimes crackled at her approach. She set up a camera above her bed. The footage at 3:17 a.m. showed a pale hand sliding the closet open, fingers testing the edge like a child curious about what lives on the other side. That hand retreated and then the closet closed. She moved out the next morning. The landlord protested, suggested maybe she was spooked, but the film was enough to move the police. They discovered a narrow crawlspace at wall height, perfect for someone small to occupy. There was no person found, but there were traces, impressions in insulation, lint in corners, the kind of evidence that suggests habitation without denying the possibility that whoever had been there had long since left. Months passed and the lives of Marcus, Aaron, Olivia, and Maya adjusted to the new grammar the events had taught them. Marcus avoided certain roads and carried a small stone in his pocket to roll between his fingers when the memory spiked. Aaron locked attic hatches and bolted additional deadbolts, yet he still woke sometimes with a song lodged in his mind that he could not place. Olivia timed her shifts to avoid storms and sat in the middle seats when she rode. Maya never bothered with baseboards that had seams. Their lives became a series of small actions designed to make them less visible, a practical armor assembled from attention and routine. Police methodically traced makers and sizes of shoes, checked registries, compared fibers under microscopes and consulted databases. Sometimes labs returned results, an obscure plant pollen that suggested a certain stretch of marshland, a hair that yielded no database match, but too often the samples degraded or the analysis gave only probabilities. Detectives cross-referenced missing persons reports with shoe sales and pawnshop logs, interviewed truck drivers who might have seen a small silhouette by the road, and checked bus maintenance logs for camera anomalies. The investigations moved with the patient, detail-oriented pace of someone translating a foreign language. They produced reports and official notes and slowly amassed a file that read like a dossier of weather and smallness. Local online communities collected artifacts into maps and timelines. Users pinned photos of umbrellas and shoes and posted with the reverence of a group trying to give shape to the shapeless. Theories multiplied: an artist staging a performance, a serial prankster, a criminal testing routes for a darker pattern, a group of people practicing a ritual for reasons of their own. Theories did not comfort the people who had been watched, they only added a gloss. The most persistent impression left by the artifacts was not malice so much as deliberate attention, small, domestic acts that required patience. Whoever left the shoes and the mittens seemed to prefer the long method: placement, removal, spacing, observation. That patience turned small tokens into a language. Sometimes the artifacts yielded threads, an odd fiber, a strand of hair that might be compared to a family's DNA, pollen from a plant that grew near a certain creek. Other times they yielded nothing at all. The initials DN appeared now and then on notes tucked under mats and folded into boxes. Investigators could not place the letters. Were they initials? A sign? A shorthand used by someone who wanted to sign their work like a craftsman? The ambiguity was unsettling because marks that could be interpreted in multiple ways multiply the mind's possible fears. The community's response was both practical and peculiarly tender. Neighbors began leaving porch lights on during rain and formed informal check-ins where someone promised to walk a friend to a car. People exchanged numbers and offered lifts. The vigilance created a small civic network. The kind of human infrastructure that forms after an event reminds a neighborhood that it can watch for one another. But vigilance erodes easily under the weight of daily life, and habits are expensive to maintain. People tire of being on guard. They also realize the burden of watchfulness often falls on the same shoulders: the lonely, the working late, the new renters. There were attempts to confront the arrangement of objects. In some accounts, homeowners who placed themselves at the edge of a disturbance and watched back received escalations. A child's drawing slipped under a door, a small shoe oriented deliberately to face the house, initials carved under a stair tread. Confrontation, in these stories, often provoked a reply pitched to match notice. The actors, when noticed, seemed to answer with increased intentionality, as if the act of being recognized was folded into the performance. That pattern implies the watchers wanted recognition more than ignorance, or perhaps resented being made invisible. It is difficult to parse motive from artifacts alone. Trauma rewrites day-to-day choices. A man avoids certain roads and develops rituals. Keys in hand, lights on, a quick scan of the rearview before he exits the car. A woman who once rode buses alone now calls a neighbor. A student moves her bed away from the wall that she imagines could be used as a stage. These changes are small and practical and also add up into a life that is narrower. People learn to make themselves small in a world that at times feels large with attention. The energy this demands is human labor, an ongoing internal workload that does not show on a timesheet. Experts weighed in. Psychologists noted how repeated, ambiguous threats cause hypervigilance and a reshaping of memory. Folklorists pointed out how communities build narratives around small events to make them meaningful. They make the mysterious legible. Criminologists said practice and repetition could be signature traits of an offender who appreciates the art of patience. Yet none of these disciplines produced a single neat explanation. The phenomena were messy: geographic dispersion, variable weather cues, and artifacts that sometimes decayed into nothing under the touch of storms. As years moved along, the incidents continued sporadically across landscapes, urban sidewalks, country byways, motel porches, and playground edges. Items changed, but the grammar remained: small, domestic, tender tokens arranged in public places. Some items were clearly personal, like a mitten pinned carefully to a fence. Others were banal, the kind of object anyone might lose. The meaning, then, hinged on placement and pattern. A toy in a gutter is ordinary. A toy arranged on a stoop and weighted by a pebble is a message. For those who endured these nights, life acquires a set of manual practices. They check thresholds twice, leave lights on, record rooms, and call friends when weather grows rough. They learn how to be invisible sometimes and, paradoxically, how to watch back. The small protective rituals, the stone in the pocket, the recorded night sounds, become a form of private labor. Those who are resilient tend to keep company during storms and to reforge domestic rhythms into structures that block the slow erosion of calm. But resilience is not victory, it is the capacity to keep living. There is one final cruelty that the artifacts ask people to understand: they do not demand spectacle. They demand a slow attention that rearranges tiny things into a pattern that belongs to the watcher and not to the watched. Where a robbery takes and leaves an obvious absence, these acts stage small presences. They make the audience into the object of concern. That quietness is the most chilling element because it cannot be easily imaged as a dramatic antagonist. The perpetrator's violence is enacted in small increments that accumulate into a life changed. So these four true stories are not a single narrative with a tidy ending. There was no moment when handcuffs clapped and a face was photographed in triumphant light. Instead, there were open files, community watches, and hands that learned to hold a lamp in the dark. Police notes record the shoes, the lullabies, the puddle on the vinyl. Reports collected fibers and images and mapped times. Detectives called sometimes with updates. Sometimes they called to say that lab results had come back inconclusive. The investigators did their work in a world where weather and time conspire to erase traces. We tell these tales not as pure entertainment but as a manual of caution and a communal record. If you find a child's shoe on a roadside in rain, do not assume it is a prop. Call the authorities and leave the object in place if it is safe to do so. If you hear a lullaby under floorboards, record it discreetly and speak to neighbors. If you ride late buses, try to ride with others when possible or switch routes. If your closet seems to breathe at night, consider recording and, if possible, calling in a professional. Small actions compound into safety. Attention is an architecture. People sometimes use it to stitch the lives of others into patterns that feel smaller and more controllable. That is the heart of what made these nights unnerving. The acts were not loud but deliberate. They were built on a patience that knows how storms will blur footprints and make small things easier to leave unnoticed. This is not to say all such artifacts are malicious. Ambiguity always exists. But presence that seeks to rearrange another's life through a string of quiet, intimate interventions demands a response. When it rains and the street becomes a river of light, look twice at small objects that appear out of place. Consider them signals, and treat them with serious care. Call your neighbors and local watch, keep records, take photographs from a distance. The difference between a token that marks an immediate danger and an object that is a sad, mislaid belonging is in the context and in the response. Community is the best instrument we have. For those who lived the stories, the nights altered them in a permanent way. They learned roots and constructed rituals. They recorded and remapped their lives against the possibility of quiet attention. The stories remain because they remind us how easily small acts can reshape our world. They teach us to check porches twice, to keep a light on, to walk in groups when stormwater sketches the world into softened edges. It is not an ending with a badge or bright lights, it is the quieter work of living cautiously and together.